Hello, everyone. Welcome to this exciting journey where we learn about the English language. Today, I will tell you a story about where English came from. Have you ever wondered why people speak English or where this language started? Well, let's begin our journey many years ago. A long time ago, there were no English words like hello or good morning. In fact, there was no English at all. Thousands of years ago, people in different parts of the world spoke different languages. There were no books, no schools, and no internet. People spoke languages that were very different from English. But over time, things began to change. The early tribes. Let's travel back to a place called England around 2,000 years ago. Back then, the people living in England didn't speak English. They spoke a language that was very old and hard to understand. There were many small groups, or tribes, in England, and these people were called the Celts. They lived in small villages, hunted for food, and made clothes from animal skins. Their language was completely different from the English we speak today. But then, something happened. People from other countries came to England, bringing their languages with them. The first group of people to come to England were the Romans. The Romans came from a place we now call Italy, and they spoke Latin, not English. The Romans were very powerful and strong. They built roads, houses, and big walls in England. For many years, Latin was the main language used in England, but it was still not English. The Germanic tribes. After the Romans left, a new group of people came to England. These people were from Germany and Denmark, and they were called the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. These groups spoke languages that were similar to each other but different from Latin, and they didn't speak like the Celts. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes were very important in the history of English. In fact, the name England comes from the word Angles. When the Angles and Saxons started living in England, their language became the most common. People started to speak a language that we now call Old English. But don't get confused. Old English doesn't sound like modern English. It was much harder to understand. For example, the word house in Old English was hus, and the word king was sening. Can you imagine speaking like that today? It would be very strange. Old English grows. For many years, the people in England spoke Old English. It was the language of farmers, kings, and everyone in between. But even Old English was not the end of the story. Over time, more changes came to England. New groups of people arrived, bringing their languages with them. One of the biggest changes came when the Vikings arrived. The Vikings were people from Norway and Sweden. They were strong warriors who sailed across the seas to England. When the Vikings came, they also brought their language, which was called Old Norse. Old Norse and Old English mixed together, and some words we use today come from Old Norse. For example, the word ski comes from the Vikings. Isn't that interesting? The Norman invasion. After the Vikings, another big group of people came to England. These people were the Normans, and they came from France. The Normans were led by a man named William the Conqueror. In the year 1066, William and his army came to England and took over. When the Normans came, they brought their language, which was French. For many years, the kings and rich people in England spoke French, but the regular people still spoke Old English. Over time, Old English and French started to mix. This is why we have many English words today that come from French. For example, words like restaurant and ballet are from French, the birth of Middle English. After many years, Old English changed so much that it became a new kind of English. We call this language Middle English. One of the most famous books written in Middle English is called The Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. Middle English is still not the same as modern English, but it is a little closer. In Middle English, many words were simpler than in Old English, and the sentences were easier to understand. Here's an example of Middle English. Won that April with his showers suit, which means when April with its sweet showers. It's still difficult to understand, but you can see how English was slowly changing. English keeps changing. After a long time, people started to speak and write in a language closer to the English we speak today. This change happened about 500 years ago. We call this time modern English. Even though it was called modern English, it was still not exactly the same as the English we use now. One of the reasons English changed was because of a famous man named William Shakespeare. Have you heard of Shakespeare? He was one of the greatest writers in history. Shakespeare lived around 400 years ago and wrote many plays and poems. He invented many new words and phrases that we still use today. For example, words like lonely and hurry were first used by Shakespeare. Imagine how different English would be without these words. English today. Now we have reached the English we speak today. English is spoken by more than 1 billion people around the world. That's a lot of people. But even today, English is still changing. New words are added all the time, especially with the rise of technology. For example, words like internet and email didn't exist 100 years ago, but now we use them every day. Conclusion of Chapter 1. So, where did English come from? It came from many different places. It started with the early tribes of England and mixed with the languages of the Romans, the Germans, the Vikings, and the French. Over thousands of years, English has changed and grown into the language we speak today. In the next chapter, we will learn more about how English spread around the world. Thank you for listening to the first chapter of this story. Stay with me for more exciting history of the English language. Welcome back. In the last chapter, we learned how English spread around the world because of explorers, settlers, and the British Empire. Today, we will talk about how English has changed in modern times. English is not the same today as it was 100 years ago. In fact, the English language is always changing. Let's start by talking about some important events that happened in the last few hundred years and how they changed English. The printing press and books. One big change in the English language happened in the 1400s. At that time, a man named Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press. Before the printing press, people had to write books by hand. This took a long time and was very expensive, so only rich people could afford books. But when the printing press was invented, books became much easier and cheaper to make. More people could buy books and learn how to read, which was very important for the English language. The first English book ever printed was The Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. With more books, English started to become more standardized. This means that people began to agree on the correct way to write and spell English words. Before, people in different parts of England spelled words differently, but with more printed books, people started to use the same spellings. This helped English become the language we know today. The rise of education. Another big change that helped English was the rise of education. Hundreds of years ago, most people did not go to school. They learned how to work on farms or in shops, but they didn't learn how to read or write. In the 1800s, however, schools started to open up for more people. Children learned how to read, write, and speak English in a more formal way. Education helped people use English in a better and more standardized way. More people could read newspapers, write letters, and understand books. Schools played a big part in making English a language that everyone could use, no matter where they lived. The influence of science and technology. The world started to change very quickly in the 1800s and 1900s. New inventions like trains, cars, and electricity made life different for many people. Science and technology became very important, and English played a big role in this. Many new scientific words were invented in English. For example, the word electricity comes from this time, and words like engine, telephone, and radio also became part of the English language. As technology grew, so did the English vocabulary. People needed new words to talk about all the new things they were discovering and inventing. The Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was a time when machines and factories changed the way people worked and lived. This happened in the 1800s and started in England. The Industrial Revolution created many new jobs and new ways of doing things. People moved to cities to work in factories, and the English language changed because of this. New words were created to talk about work, machines, and factories. For example, the word industry became very important during this time. English had to change to keep up with all the new things happening in the world. World Wars and English. In the 1900s, the world went through two big wars, World War I and World War II. These wars had a big effect on many countries, including English-speaking countries like the United Kingdom and the United States. During the wars, soldiers from different countries worked together and shared their languages. After the wars, English became even more important because the United States became one of the strongest countries in the world. American soldiers, movies, and music spread English to many more places. English started to become the language of international business, politics, and communication. The role of American English. Let's talk a little more about American English. In Chapter 2, we learned how English settlers came to America in the 1600s. Over time, the English spoken in America became a little different from the English spoken in the United Kingdom. This is why we have two types of English today, British English and American English. Some words in American English are different from British English. For example, in the United Kingdom, people say lift to talk about the machine that takes people up and down in a building. But in the United States, people say elevator. In the United Kingdom, people say flat to mean a place to live. But in the United States, they say apartment. Even though there are some differences, British English and American English are still very similar. People from the United States and the United Kingdom can easily understand each other, even if they use different words sometimes. The rise of American media. One of the reasons American English became so popular was because of American movies, music, and television. In the 1900s, Hollywood became the center of the movie industry. People all over the world watched American movies and heard American English being spoken. American music, especially pop music, also became very popular. Singers like Elvis Presley, Michael Jackson, and Beyoncé helped spread American English to countries all over the world. Today, many people learn English by listening to American songs and watching American TV shows. English on the Internet. The Internet has had a huge effect on the English language. The Internet was invented in the 1990s, and since then, it has changed the way we communicate. English is the most common language used on the Internet. Websites, social media, and online videos are often in English, and many people around the world use English to communicate online. Because of the Internet, English has become even more global. People in different countries use English to chat with friends, play online games, and share information. The Internet has also created new English words like blog, selfie, and emoji. These words didn't exist before the Internet, but now we use them every day. English in business and travel. English is also the language of international business. Companies from different countries use English to communicate with each other. For example, a company in Japan might use English to talk to a company in Germany. This is because English is the language that most people in the world understand. English is also important for travel. When people travel to other countries, they often use English to communicate, even if it's not their first language. For example, if someone from China visits Italy, they might speak English to the hotel staff or ask for directions in English. This is because English is often used as a global language in airports, hotels, and tourist spots. New English words and slang. As the world changes, so does the English language. New English words are created all the time, and people use different types of English in different places. For example, in some countries people use a lot of slang words. Slang is informal language used in casual conversations. In the United States, people might say cool to mean something is good, but in the United Kingdom, people might say brilliant. These are just two examples of how slang changes depending on where you are. English is always evolving, and new words and slang are added to the language every year. The future of English. Now that we know how English has changed in modern times, let's think about the future. What will English look like in 100 years? Will people still speak English the same way we do today? It's hard to say, but one thing is for sure. English will keep changing. New technologies, new cultures, and new ways of communicating will continue to shape the English language. Who knows? Maybe one day people will speak a kind of English that we wouldn't even recognize. Conclusion of Chapter 3. In this chapter, we learned how English changed in modern times. The printing press, education, science, technology, and even wars all played a part in shaping the English language. American movies, music, and the internet helped spread English around the world, and today English is used for business, travel, and everyday communication. In the next chapter, we will explore the different types of English spoken around the world. We will see how people in different countries speak. Thank you for staying with me on this journey through the history of English. Chapter 4. The many types of English around the world. Welcome back. In our last chapter, we talked about how English changed in modern times. Today, we will look at the different types of English spoken around the world. English is a global language, but it's not spoken the same way everywhere. Different countries have their own unique ways of speaking English. Let's explore how English sounds in different parts of the world. British English versus American English. Let's start with the two most well-known types of English, British English and American English. These two types of English come from the United Kingdom and the United States. Even though they are very similar, there are some differences in vocabulary, spelling, and pronunciation. For example, in British English, people say boot to talk about the back of a car, but in American English, people say trunk. British people say lorry for a big vehicle, but Americans say truck. There are also differences in spelling. In British English, words like color and favor have a U, but in American English, they are spelled color and favor without the U. When it comes to pronunciation, there are some clear differences too. British English is often said to sound more formal, while American English has a more relaxed sound. But even within these countries, there are many different accents and ways of speaking. Australian English now, let's travel to Australia. Australian English is similar to British English because Australia was once a British colony. However, Australian English has its own unique style. One of the biggest differences in Australian English is the accent. Australians speak in a way that makes their English sound a little faster and more relaxed. Australians also have their own special words. For example, they often shorten words to make them easier to say. Instead of afternoon, Australians might say arvo. Instead of breakfast, they say brekkie. They also use words like mate to mean friend and Barbie to mean barbecue. Even though Australian English is different from British and American English, people from these countries can still understand each other easily. Canadian English next. Let's visit Canada. Canadian English is a mix of British and American English. This is because Canada was once a British colony, but it is also close to the United States. Canadians use some British spellings like color with a U, but they also use American words like elevator instead of lift. One interesting thing about Canadian English is the accent. Canadians have a unique way of pronouncing certain words. For example, they often say about in a way that sounds like a boot to people from other countries. Just like in the United States and the United Kingdom, there are different accents in different parts of Canada. Indian English now, let's travel to India. India is one of the largest English-speaking countries in the world. English is used in government, schools, and business, even though most people in India speak their own local languages like Hindi, Bengali, or Tamil. Indian English has its own style. People in India sometimes use English words in ways that are different from British or American English. For example, in India, people say prepone to mean the opposite of postpone. If a meeting is moved to an earlier time, They say it has been preponed. The accent in Indian English is also unique. Indian English speakers often roll their R sounds and speak with a rhythm that comes from their local languages. Indian English has a rich mix of influences, and it's one of the reasons why English in India sounds so special. African English. Now let's visit Africa. English is spoken in many African countries because of the British Empire, which we talked about in Chapter 2. In countries like Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa, English is one of the official languages. But just like in India, people in Africa speak their own local languages, along with English. African English is very diverse. In each African country, English sounds a little different. For example, in Nigeria, people often mix English with local languages like Yoruba or Igbo. This mix of languages creates something called Nigerian Pidgin English. Nigerian Pidgin English is a simplified version of English with words and grammar from local languages. For example, instead of saying, "How are you?" in Standard English, someone might say, "How you day?" in Nigerian Pidgin. In South Africa, people speak something called South African English. This type of English has its own special words. For example, South Africans use the word robot to talk about traffic lights. Other varieties of English. As you can see, English is spoken in many different ways around the world. Each country has its own version of English, and even within countries, people speak English in different ways. For example, people in New York City speak English differently from people in Texas or California. In the United Kingdom, people from London speak differently from people in Scotland or Wales. English is a flexible language that changes depending on where it's spoken. This is one of the reasons why English is such a rich and interesting language. People from different countries can speak English in their own way, and it still connects them to others around the world. English accents. One of the most interesting things about English is the different accents people use. An accent is the way someone pronounces words. Even people who speak the same language can have very different accents depending on where they are from. For example, someone from the southern United States might say the word right with a long I sound, while someone from the northern United States might say it with a shorter sound. In the United Kingdom, there are many different accents too. People from London sound very different from people in northern England or Scotland. Accents are an important part of language because they show where a person is from and can even reflect their culture and history. English slang and informal language. In addition to different types of English, people in different countries also use different slang. Slang is informal language that is often used in casual conversations. Slang can change quickly, and new slang words are created all the time. For example, in the United States, people might say something is cool if they think it's good, while in the United Kingdom, they might say something is brilliant. In Australia, people might say something is ace to mean the same thing. Slang gives each type of English its own special flavor and keeps the language fresh and exciting. Conclusion of Chapter 4. In this chapter, we explored the many types of English spoken around the world. From British English to American English, from Singlish in Singapore to Nigerian Pidgin English, there are many ways to speak English. Each country has its own unique way of using the language, and this makes English a truly global and diverse language. In the next chapter, we will talk about how English is learned and taught around the world. We will see why English is so important and how people in different countries learn this amazing language. Thank you for continuing this journey with me, and I hope you're enjoying learning about the story of English. Chapter 5. How English is learned around the world. Welcome back to the final chapter of our story about the English language. In the last chapter, we explored the different types of English spoken around the world, from British and American English to Singlish and Nigerian Pidgin. Now let's look at how people in different countries learn English and why it is so important. Why do people learn English? English is one of the most widely spoken languages in the world, but why do so many people learn English? One of the main reasons is that English is a global language. It's used in international business, politics, science, and technology. If people want to communicate with others from different countries, English is often the language they use. In addition, many people learn English because it can help them get better jobs. For example, someone who speaks English might be able to work for an international company or travel to different countries for work. English is also the language of higher education in many places, so people who want to study abroad often learn English first. English is important in many fields, from medicine to engineering to tourism. This is why so many people around the world choose to learn English, even if it's not their first language. Learn English in different ways. Depending on where they live and what resources they have, people learn English in various ways. In some countries, English is taught in schools from a very young age. In other countries, people learn English by attending language classes or using online resources. Let's look at some of the ways people learn English. English in schools. In many countries, English is taught as a second language in schools. This means that students learn English along with their native language. For example, in countries like India, Nigeria, and the Philippines, English is a required subject in school. Students learn how to read, write, and speak English, and they often use English textbooks and take English exams. In some European countries like Sweden and the Netherlands, students start learning English in elementary school. By the time they finish high school, many of them can speak English fluently. This is partly because English is often present in popular culture, like movies, music, and video games, which helps students practice English outside of school. Private English classes. In other countries, English is not always taught in schools, or it may not be taught in a way that helps students become fluent. In these cases, people often take private English classes. These classes can be in a language school or with a private tutor. For example, in countries like Japan and South Korea, many students attend private English classes after school. These classes focus on helping students improve their English skills, especially speaking and listening. Some people also take private English lessons with tutors, either in person or online. Learning English online. With the rise of the internet, more and more people are learning English online. There are many websites, apps, and YouTube channels that help people learn English from anywhere in the world. People can watch videos, do exercises, and even talk to native English speakers through online platforms. For example, many people use apps like Duolingo or Memrise to practice English vocabulary and grammar. Others watch YouTube videos where teachers explain English in simple ways. Learning English online is popular because it's flexible and often free. People can learn at their own pace and practice whenever they have time. English immersion. One of the best ways to learn English is through immersion. This means surrounding yourself with English so that you hear and speak it all the time. People who live in English-speaking countries often learn English this way. For example, if someone moves to the United States, the United Kingdom, or Australia, they will need to use English every day to communicate with others. Even if people don't live in an English-speaking country, they can still try immersion by watching English movies, listening to English music, and reading English books. This helps them get used to how English sounds and how people use it in real life. Challenges of learning English. Learning a new language is not easy, and English can be especially challenging for some people. This is because English has many rules, and sometimes those rules have exceptions. For example, why do we say goose but geese for more than one goose, but we say moose and moose for more than one moose? English spelling and pronunciation can also be difficult. Words like knife and night have silent letters which can be confusing for learners. Another challenge is that English has many different accents and dialects. Someone might learn British English in school, but when they listen to American English, it might sound very different. This can make it hard for learners to understand all types of English. How to overcome these challenges? Even though learning English can be hard, there are many ways to overcome these challenges. One important tip is to practice as much as possible. The more someone listens to and speaks English, the more comfortable they will become with the language. It's also helpful to focus on the most important parts of English first. For example, instead of trying to learn every single grammar rule, learners can start by practicing the most common words and phrases. This will help them communicate in simple situations, like ordering food at a restaurant or asking for directions. Watching English TV shows and movies with subtitles can also be a fun way to practice. Learners can hear how native speakers use English in real conversations and pick up new words and phrases along the way. The importance of confidence. One of the biggest obstacles to learning English is confidence. Many people feel shy or nervous when speaking English because they are afraid of making mistakes. But mistakes are a natural part of learning any language. The more someone practices speaking English, the more confident they will become. It's important to remember that even native English speakers make mistakes sometimes. What matters most is being able to communicate and understand others. So, if you're learning English, don't be afraid to speak up. The more you practice, the better you will get. English as a lingua franca. We've talked a lot about how English is spoken around the world and how people learn it. But did you know that English is also used as a lingua franca? A lingua franca is a language that people use to communicate when they don't speak the same native language. For example, if someone from Japan wants to talk to someone from Brazil, they might use English as their common language, even though it's not their first language. This is because English is often the language that people from different countries learn to communicate with each other. English is used as a lingua franca in international business, science, and travel. This is one of the reasons why English is so important in the world today. The future of learning English. As the world becomes more connected, more people will need to learn English. Technology will continue to play a big role in language learning. Already, people can use apps, online courses, and virtual tutors to improve their English skills. In the future, we might see even more advanced tools, like virtual reality programs, that let learners practice English in a virtual English-speaking environment. English will continue to be a global language, and people will keep finding new and creative ways to learn and use it. Whether through traditional classes, online learning, or immersion, the possibilities for learning English are endless. Conclusion of Chapter 5. In this chapter, we learned how people around the world learn English. Whether through schools, private classes, or online resources, there are many ways to become fluent in English. We also talked about some of the challenges of learning English and how to overcome them. Confidence, practice, and a positive attitude are key to becoming a successful English learner. Final thoughts on where did English come from? Now that we've reached the end of our story, let's think back to where we started. English began as a small language spoken by tribes in England. Over the centuries, it grew and changed, influenced by different cultures, peoples, and events. Today, English is spoken by millions of people all around the world in many different forms. I hope you've enjoyed learning about the history of English and how it became the global language we know today. Remember, no matter where you are or what type of English you speak, you are part of this amazing story. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the history of the English language. Keep practicing your English, and remember, English is always evolving, and you're part of its future.